The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like sleeping machinery, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made 2:08 a.m. feel like the middle of nowhere. Ashley Cooper stood at the medication cart in St. Michael's Trauma Bay, her hands moving through the ritualistic check of vials and syringes with the kind of muscle memory that only 8 months of night shifts could build. The antiseptic smell hung thick in the air, mixing with something else, stale coffee from the break room 3 corridors down and the faint metallic edge of blood that never quite washed completely away. She wore the same navy scrubs as every other nurse on the floor, but the way she moved through the bay was different. Efficient. Certain. The kind of certainty that came from knowing exactly what needed to happen before it happened. Inside her jacket lining, sewn between the layers of fabric where no one would think to look, was a faded unit patch. 5th Special Forces Group. The edges were worn soft from years of being there, and Ashley ran her thumb across the stitching every night before her shift, a ritual so ingrained she barely noticed doing it anymore. That patch was the only physical reminder that Captain Ashley Cooper had existed before she became just another night shift nurse in a Colorado Springs trauma bay. The rest of her life, the one that lived in classified folders and encrypted files, remained exactly where it needed to be. Hidden. The ER doors slid open at 3:14 a.m., and the paramedics wheeled in a stretcher carrying a man who looked like he'd been assembled from Army recruitment posters. Major David Reyes. 52 years old. Command presence that filled the bay even while he lay unconscious, his left leg wrapped in compression bandaging, his right arm already starting to swell. Training accident. Rappel line failure. The paramedics' report was clinical and brief: blunt force trauma, loss of consciousness at scene, vital stable but trending soft. Bay 4 was already prepped. Ashley had done it 15 minutes before he arrived, anticipating the incoming trauma like she always did. She didn't know Reyes. Not officially. Not in any way that would show up on employment records or in the hospital computer system. What she knew was that Major David Reyes commanded the 5th Special Forces Group C Squadron, the same unit where her son was a team sergeant. The same unit where her son had been stationed for the last 18 months in the Hindu Kush Mountains, conducting operations that the government classified at a level she was no longer cleared to hear about. Reyes was the man responsible for her son's safety. Which meant, for the next 72 hours while he recovered in Bay 4, Ashley was going to be responsible for making sure Reyes made it home alive. The hospital hierarchy understood her as furniture. Competent, reliable, essentially invisible. The attending physicians nodded at her when they passed. The residents barely acknowledged her existence except to bark orders. The board members who appeared during quarterly reviews looked through her the way people look through glass. This invisibility was not accidental. It was cultivated. It was necessary. Army intelligence had placed her at St. Michael's 6 months ago because someone in the supply chain was stealing surgical equipment, specialized trauma gear, the kind of materials that had no business appearing on black market channels in the Middle East. The investigation had expanded from there: 3 hospitals, 2 supply depots, and a network of connections that ran from Colorado Springs to people who definitely shouldn't have access to American military-grade medical technology. Ashley was the eyes inside the system. She was also, technically, a nurse. Both things were equally true. Dr. Marcus Pierce arrived on the trauma floor at 4:22 a.m., which was odd because he wasn't scheduled to be in until 6 o'clock. He was tall in the way that tall men who've spent their entire lives being told they're impressive tend to be: shoulders back, stride wide, the kind of presence that tried very hard to announce itself. He was also, from everything Ashley had observed over 8 months, a man who despised competence in people who didn't have an MD behind their name. He'd made that clear from her first week, when she'd caught a medication error that the resident had missed and corrected it before it reached the patient. Pierce had not thanked her. He'd questioned her credentials instead. By her 3rd week, she understood the pattern. Pierce had built his entire professional identity on the assumption that he was the smartest person in every room. And then Ashley Cooper showed up and quietly, consistently, kept catching things he missed. Patients gravitated toward her assessments. When she said a patient was deteriorating, the patient was deteriorating. When she recommended a medication adjustment, the patient's labs improved. When she suggested a different approach to monitoring, outcomes shifted. None of this was audible. She didn't make announcements. She didn't demand credit. She simply existed, and her existence was enough to make Dr. Pierce feel like he was being erased. The vending machine on the second-floor corridor was the worst possible location for what happened next, but vending machines were always where the real conversations occurred in hospitals. People let their guards down at vending machines. They were alone. No patients around. No staff to overhear. Just the hum of machinery and the rattle of cans dropping into the dispensing slot. Ashley was getting coffee at 5:06 a.m., which was her routine, black, no sugar, the kind of coffee that tasted like it had been designed to keep you awake rather than enjoyed. Dr. Pierce stepped in front of the vending machine with his own coffee already in hand, blocking her exit with the kind of casual ownership that suggested he'd never considered she might need to leave. 8 months and you're still pulling night shift. His voice carried that particular tone, the one that made everything sound like a question but wasn't actually asking anything. I'm surprised the hospital hasn't caught on yet. Ashley didn't respond. She reached for her coffee and waited for the rest of it. I'm being serious. NCLEX pass rates in Colorado are public record. You're aware of that, right? I looked it up. He paused, letting the implication settle. Or maybe you didn't take it in Colorado. Maybe you took it somewhere else. Somewhere the standards aren't quite as rigorous. Tennessee, maybe? Mississippi. He smiled in a way that involved his mouth but not his eyes. I've heard you can get anything online these days. Credentials. Licenses. References. The silence stretched between them for exactly 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Ashley's mind executed a perfect tactical assessment, the angle of his body, the position of his hands, the locations of the nearest witnesses, the distance to the emergency call button, the legal implications of what would happen if she responded with anything other than complete composure. She had been trained to handle threats. Most threats just didn't come in the form of a doctor at a vending machine in a hospital at 5 in the morning. She turned to look at him. Really look at him. The kind of look that came from understanding people in their entirety, their fears, their motivations, the specific anatomy of their insecurity. Her eyes were grey, the color of winter ocean water, and when she looked at someone with her full attention, they generally experienced the sensation of being X-rayed. I wonder what you're so afraid of, doctor. Then she walked past him, coffee in hand, back toward Bay 4 where Major Reyes was beginning to stir, beginning to wake, beginning to recognize the face of the woman who would keep him alive until he could get back to her son. The coffee was still warm in her hand when Dr. Pierce materialized outside the trauma bay doors, his white coat catching the fluorescent light like a sail catching wind. He had a clipboard. He always had a clipboard when he wanted an audience. It was Tuesday morning at 6:33 a.m., grand rounds, and the rotating residents were trailing behind him like ducklings following their mother toward a cliff edge. Gentlemen, Pierce announced, loud enough for the staff station to hear, loud enough for Ashley to feel the weight of his attention settle across her shoulders like wet concrete. This is an exemplary moment to discuss protocol deviation. Catastrophic protocol deviation. He stood in front of Bay 3, where Ashley had spent the last 4 hours managing a post-operative cardiac patient. The residents gathered, their faces eager, ready to absorb whatever wisdom their superior was about to dispense. One of them, a third-year resident named Kowalski, actually pulled out his phone to take notes. Nurse Cooper, Pierce said, turning to face her directly, his voice dropping into the register he used when he wanted something to hurt, administered 0.5 milligrams of digoxin to this patient without a physician order. Correct. Ashley didn't move. Didn't blink. The monitor behind her beeped its steady rhythm, sinus, regular, exactly where it should be. That's incorrect, she said. Her voice was level. Flat. The voice of someone who had learned long ago that anger was a luxury and ice was a strategy. The order was written at 11:43 p.m. In your signature. Pierce's jaw tightened. The resident shifted. Kowalski stopped typing. What I meant to say, Pierce continued, his words now clipped, sharp-edged, is that the dosage was inappropriate for this patient's renal function. You should have flagged it. A competent nurse would have caught the error before administration. The words hung there. Competent. As if she were the opposite. As if her 8 months of perfect charting, perfect outcomes, perfect patient trust meant nothing against his credential and his tone and his certainty that he was right simply because he was the one speaking. One of the younger residents, a woman named Torres, made eye contact with Ashley. Her expression was apologetic. Sympathetic. The kind of look people gave to people they thought were about to be publicly destroyed. Ashley set down her coffee cup on the counter beside her. The clink of ceramic against Formica was somehow louder than Pierce's voice had been. She looked at him. Let the silence stretch. Let it get uncomfortable. Let it fill the hallway and the trauma bay and the space between them until the fluorescent light seemed to hum louder, trying to fill the vacuum. The patient's creatinine cleared 3 hours ago, Ashley said finally. One sentence. Surgical. Precise. Renal function normalized. The dose was appropriate then. It's appropriate now. The patient's heart rate is 62. Blood pressure is 118/76. If you want to discuss protocols, doctor, let's discuss why you ordered a medication without checking labs first. She turned. Walked away. Walked back toward Bay 4, where Major Reyes was beginning to stir, beginning to open his eyes, his expression still foggy with the remnants of sedation. The residents followed her with their eyes instead of Pierce. Kowalski had stopped typing. Pierce stood in the doorway for 6 more seconds. Then he left. But that wasn't the end of it. It never was. 3 hours later, Ashley was standing at the vending machine on the 3rd floor, feeding $2 bills into the slot when Pierce appeared behind her like a sudden pressure change. He wasn't alone. He had Marcus Chen with him, the hospital's chief of medicine, a man with gray hair and the kind of exhaustion that came from 40 years of administrative politics. They stopped 5 feet away, but close enough that everyone in the hallway could hear. Captain, Pierce said, using her rank like a slur. May I have a word about your recommendation in Bay 5? Ashley pressed the button for black coffee. Watched it fall. The machine whirred. Mechanical. Indifferent. She did not turn around. The patient arrived with acute MI, Pierce continued. You suggested we hold the nitroglycerine and go straight to cardiac catheterization. That was outside your scope of practice, wasn't it? Now Ashley turned. She held the warm cup in her left hand. Her right hand hung at her side, steady as a resting heartbeat. The patient's systolic was 88, she said. She was speaking to Pierce, but her eyes moved, briefly, to Chen. Let him see that she knew he was there. That she wasn't asking for permission or sympathy. Nitrates would have dropped it further. That would have been contraindicated. The attending physician agreed. Cath lab got him to the lab 6 minutes faster. He's stable. That's not your decision to make, Pierce said. I'm a nurse. I'm supposed to catch what doctors miss. You're supposed to follow orders. I follow orders that don't kill patients, Ashley said. The words came out like she was reading from a manual. No emotion. No heat. Just fact. I suggested a different dosage. The physician listened. The patient lived. If that's insubordination, then I'm guilty. Call security. She said it flat. Not a challenge. Not a threat. Just a statement of what the outcome would be, as if she'd already calculated it and accepted it before she opened her mouth. Pierce's face went purple. Actually purple. Chen put a hand on his arm, the gesture both calming and restraining, and Ashley understood in that moment what was happening. Pierce had brought the chief of medicine as a witness. Had been hoping she would break, would apologize, would crater under the weight of administrative authority. Instead, she had turned it into a situation where firing her would require explaining to Chen why they were disciplining the nurse who kept catching errors that the doctors missed. "You're overstepping," Pierce said finally. "I'm keeping your patients alive," Ashley replied. She turned back to the vending machine, took her coffee, walked away. Behind her, she heard Chen say something low to Pierce, something she couldn't quite make out but could feel in the way the hallway suddenly went very quiet. In the way the other nurses at the station found reasons to look at their charts instead of at Pierce, instead of at whatever expression was currently taking over his face. This was day 247 of her assignment at St. Michael's. 8 months of night shifts and code blues and patients with families standing in waiting rooms praying for someone to save their lives. 8 months of Dr. Pierce's campaign to destroy her, to prove that she was incompetent, that she was a fraud, that the way patients trusted her instincts was dangerous and delusional. 8 months of him inventing protocol violations, of him spreading rumors through the resident rotation that she'd bought her NCLEX credentials online, that she was sleeping with the attending physicians to get preferential assignments, that she had no medical training and was somehow fooling everyone. And 8 months of her not breaking, not trembling, not crying in a bathroom stall, not snapping back with anger or defensiveness. Just ice. Just the cold, flat stare. Just the one sentence that cut deeper than his tirades because it was true, because it exposed the thing he was most afraid of, that she was better at this job than he was, that patients trusted her more, that his years of training and his MD and his name on the hospital roster meant nothing compared to her ability to recognize when someone was about to die and stop it from happening. The thing Pierce didn't understand was that Ashley Cooper had spent 3 tours in the Hindu Kush learning that survival had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with staying calm when the world was burning. That she'd held more dying people in her arms than he'd ever treated in a career that had never once placed him in a room where his mistake meant someone's body stopped working. That the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one with the 5th Special Forces insignia, barely visible if you knew where to look, represented a level of training that made his medical degree look like a certificate from a cereal box. But she couldn't tell him that. She couldn't tell anyone. Not yet. Ashley walked through the hallway toward the elevators, toward the stairwell, toward Bay 4 and Major David Reyes, who was still the commanding officer of her son's unit, who was still the man responsible for keeping her boy alive in mountains 10,000 miles away. She had a mission. 2 missions, actually. The official one, the reason Army intelligence had placed her here 6 months ago to investigate a suspected medical supply theft ring operating out of the hospital's warehouse. And the personal one, the unspoken one, the one that had nothing to do with Pentagon orders or classified briefings or secure phone calls made from locked rooms. She was going to keep him alive. She was going to do it quietly, professionally, without breaking protocol or revealing herself or letting Dr. Pierce's campaign of humiliation distract her from what mattered. The elevator doors opened. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the part that would change everything. The doors burst open at 2:56 a.m. 6'5" of raw paranoia wrapped in a tank top soaked with sweat and something darker. The man's pupils were blown wide, his body moving in the jagged rhythm of someone who hadn't slept in 3 days. He was screaming about trackers, government implants in his blood, satellites following him, voices coming through the hospital walls. His hands gripped a metal chair like it weighed nothing, and he swung it in a wide arc, the leg connecting with the reception desk with a sound like a rifle shot. The room exploded into motion. A resident bolted for the stairwell. 2 nurses scrambled backward, nearly knocking over a crash cart. Security's hand went to his radio, but he was already moving toward the exit, talking fast into his shoulder MIC about an ETA for backup. The charge nurse at the central station spun her chair away from the monitors and pressed herself against the wall. Dr. Pierce, who had been reviewing charts at the counter, didn't hesitate. He simply walked through the double doors into the hallway and kept walking, his tablet tucked under one arm like he'd just stepped out for coffee. Everyone ran. Ashley was restocking the supply cart at Bay 1 when she heard the chair hit the desk. She knew that sound, the particular ring of metal striking laminate under force. She'd heard similar sounds in the Hindu Kush, in compounds where everything that wasn't bolted down became a weapon. She didn't turn immediately. She finished placing the last fur kit in its slot, closed the drawer with a soft click, and then moved. Her hands were visible before her feet cleared the cart. Palms open. Fingers spread. The universal signal for non-threat. She didn't run toward the exit like the others. She ran toward him, her voice dropping an octave as she closed the distance, becoming something entirely different, not a nurse asking permission, but a presence that commanded the air around her. Hey! Hey, look at me! Not loud. Just level. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. You're safe. I know you don't believe that, but you are. The man swung the chair again, aiming at the vending machines this time. Ashley stepped into his peripheral vision, her movements fluid and predictable, nothing sudden. She kept her hands visible. Kept talking. My name is Ashley. I work here. You don't have to put down the chair yet. We can just talk for a minute. Her voice was like a tank idling in a garage, mechanical, steady, completely without fear. What's your name? He didn't answer. His eyes fixed on a point somewhere above her head, and his jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscles working. The chair stayed raised. Those voices you're hearing? That's your brain working too hard. You haven't slept. She took a step closer, hand still visible. I can help with that. But first we need to get you somewhere quiet. 45 seconds had passed. The security officer was still on his radio somewhere down the hall. The trauma bay was empty now except for Ashley and the man and his chair. She could feel the weight of his paranoia like a physical thing, the certainty in his eyes that everyone was against him, that his own nervous system was the enemy. She took another step. You came to the hospital because part of you knows something's wrong. That took courage. Smart thing to do. Her hands didn't waver. I'm going to help you sit down now. Not because I'm trying to trap you. Because you're exhausted and your brain is lying to you about what's happening. 60 seconds. The chair dropped. Just fell away from his hands like it suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. He swayed, and Ashley moved with him, one hand steady on his elbow, guiding him toward the nearest chair at the waiting area. Her other hand was already reaching for a blood pressure cuff, her movements practiced and efficient. Sit. Right here. You did the right thing coming in. He Saturday. The moment his weight hit the chair, his shoulders sagged, and something in his face shifted, the paranoia pulling back just far enough for exhaustion to show through. Ashley was already prepping the fore kit, her fingers moving with precision, finding the vein in his left arm before he even realized what was happening. What's your name? She asked again. Marcus, he whispered. Marcus. Good. I'm putting an 4 in. You might feel a pinch. She slid the needle in with the smooth motion of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. The catheter seated, the tourniquet released, the first bag of fluids already running. You're going to be okay. But she wasn't looking at Marcus anymore. Her eyes had shifted to Bay 4, visible through the open door 30 feet away. Major David Reyes lay motionless on the hospital bed, the ventilator that had been breathing for him silent. The monitors beside his bed showed what her training recognized immediately. The chest wasn't rising, wasn't falling, no mechanical breath pushing air into lungs. The oxygen saturation number flashed red on the monitor, 52. Ashley's entire body went still for a fraction of a second. Then her jaw clenched, and she straightened, her voice becoming something completely different. Get someone from the charge station. Now. Not a request. A command. She was already moving, her hands leaving Marcus and the 4 line as the resident who'd come back from the stairwell, a kid named Chen who was still pale with adrenaline, stared at her. Needle decompression kit. Bay 4. Run. She didn't wait for him to move. She was already there, her eye scanning Reyes's chest for the landmarks she needed. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The anatomy was the same whether it was Colorado Springs or the Hindu Kush. The physics of a collapsed lung didn't care about geography. He was fine 2 minutes ago, Chen said, his voice uncertain, holding the kit out. Tension pneumothorax. Air pockets compressing his heart. Ashley's hands were already cleaning the site with antiseptic, her voice clinical and precise in a way that made the resident step back. This wasn't a nurse speaking anymore. This was someone who'd done emergency medicine under fire. 14-gauge angiocath, between the ribs. She found the spot with her fingers, felt the space between the ribs where the needle needed to go. The kit was open. The needle was in her hand. She slid it home with the smooth certainty of someone for whom this wasn't theoretical, it was muscle memory burned in through repetition and desperation. The hiss came immediately. Air escaping. The pressure releasing. The lung re-expanding as the tension that had been crushing Reyes's heart dissipated into the room like a held breath finally released. The monitors shifted almost instantly. The oxygen saturation climbed, 55. 61, 68. 76, 85. 91, stable. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Chen stared at her, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open. 2 nurses had appeared in the doorway, frozen in place. One of them was looking at Ashley's hands, at the way she'd moved, at the precision, at the complete absence of hesitation. The way she'd known exactly where to put the needle on the first try. The way her voice had changed the moment an actual life was in danger. "Get ICU on the phone," Ashley said, already moving to check Reyes's pupils, her fingers gentle despite the command in her voice. "Tell them we're coming up with a post-decompression tension pneu. He needs a chest tube." Chen moved without questioning. The nurses moved too. But one of them, a day-shift nurse named Rodriguez who sometimes covered nights, kept staring at Ashley's jacket as she turned. For just a moment, when she'd leaned over Reyes's chest, the jacket lining had shifted. Rodriguez caught a glimpse of something sewn inside. Something faded. Something with red and gold stitching that looked like it might have been a patch. The kind of patch that didn't come from hospital supply. Rodriguez opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again. Because something about the way Ashley had just moved, just commanded the room, just known exactly what to do in 30 seconds of controlled crisis, that something made Rodriguez realize she might have been badly, dangerously wrong about who exactly was standing next to her in this trauma bay. Sinus rhythm. The monitor beeped its confirmation. Rodriguez's hand had stopped shaking halfway through saying it aloud. The air in bay 4 felt different now, thinner, like the room had exhaled after holding its breath for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. Ashley stepped back from the bed. Her gloved hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The 14-gauge catheter had gone between Major Reyes's ribs at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, exactly where anatomy demanded it, and the hiss of air escaping from the pleural space had been the sound of a lung expanding again. O2 sat had climbed, 68, then 72, then 82, then 89. The air pocket crushing his heart had collapsed. The tension pneumothorax was no longer a death sentence. She peeled off her gloves. The room was so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical rhythm, steady and patient, doing what human lungs couldn't do alone. "You just..." Rodriguez started. Stopped. Started again. That was a "you didn't even check his breath" sounds. Left and right. Ashley's voice was different now. Not asking. Not requesting. The kind of voice that made residents move without thinking. Confirm bilateral air exchange. Then get a chest X-ray to rule out pneumomediastinum. Rodriguez nodded. I still locked on her. 2 residents stood frozen in the doorway. They'd been there the entire time, she'd felt them arrive halfway through, drawn by the urgency radiating from the code. Their faces had that particular expression of people watching someone become something other than what they'd assumed. One of them was trying to write down what he'd just seen in his mental notebook, except his mind was going static. The other one, a 3rd-year named Chen, had his mouth slightly open. Call thoracic surgery. Tell them we'll likely need observation for at least 48 hours. Ashley was already moving toward the medication cart. And someone get me the post-procedure vitals chart. Full workup. The resident scattered. That was the thing about command voice, it didn't require rank to work. It just required that whoever was speaking had already moved past fear into something colder and more focused. Ashley washed her hands. The soap smelled like industrial lavender and failure prevention. She kept her movements precise, deliberate. Muscle memory. 12 years ago, hands that had done this same procedure in a mud-walled compound 40 kilometers south of Kabul. Hands that had talked a 22-year-old army medic through the steps while rounds cracked past the window and Taliban fighters tried the door. Hands that knew oxygen sat climbs like meditation, like prayer, like the only language that mattered in a room where someone was about to die. 20 minutes passed. The kind of time that dissolves into the background when you're focused on work. Ashley documented everything. Procedure time. Equipment used. Patient response. Vital sign progression. The chart was building its own narrative, the way medical records always did, a story told in numbers and abbreviations, a map of crisis and recovery that would follow Major Reyes from this moment forward. That was when Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway. He didn't enter. He stood at the threshold like a man checking a room he'd rented out to strangers. His expression was difficult to read. That particular kind of difficult that happens when someone has just realized something is wrong but hasn't decided whether to acknowledge it yet. His eyes moved from Major Reyes to the monitor to Ashley and back again. What happened here? Not a question. Tension pneumothorax. Needle decompression at for 18. Sinus rhythm restored at for 22. Ashley didn't look up from the chart. Patient stabilized. Thoracic surgery notified. Waiting on imaging confirmation. Pierce's jaw tightened. She could see it even without looking directly at him. The muscle at the hinge of his lower face pulled tight, the way it did when a man was recalibrating his entire understanding of a situation. You performed the procedure. Correct. Alone. The patient was crashing. Seconds mattered. She turned a page in the chart. Her voice was even, flat, the kind of flat that could cut through steel if steel cared about tone. Residents were mobilizing. No time to wait for physician supervision. Pierce's face did something complicated. Anger and something else. Something that looked like recognition, which was worse. Much worse. He turned and left without another word. That should have been the moment Ashley knew. That particular brand of silence after someone's face has registered that they've just been publicly shown up by a nurse, that's usually the moment when a decent person accepts what happened and moves forward. When a competent administrator nods and files the incident under exemplary performance under pressure and lets it go. Dr. Pierce was not a decent person. The phone call started an hour later. Ashley didn't know about the first one until Rodriguez mentioned it casually, something about Pierce in his office with the door closed and his voice elevated enough that people could hear him through the walls. Something about board favors and institutional liability and exactly what kind of nurses the hospital was hiring these days. The second call landed differently. A message from the Colorado State Nursing Board asking her to come in for a preliminary interview regarding scope of practice violations reported by a physician at her workplace. The message was formal, cold, the way government communications always are when they're about to ruin someone's life. The third phone call she didn't know about until her badge disappeared. She was clocking out at 6:02 a.m., end of shift, exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tired that comes from spending 8 hours holding someone alive with your hands and your knowledge and your absolute refusal to let physics win. The security desk was staffed by Marcus, a guy she'd worked with for 8 months, who'd always been friendly enough. He looked uncomfortable. "I need your badge and access card," he said. "And your parking pass. Security clearance is suspended pending investigation." The words were there. They were in order. They made grammatical sense. They still took several seconds to arrange themselves into something her brain could understand. Suspended for what? "I'm not authorized to discuss details." Personnel from HR will contact you within 24 hours. The badge was heavier in her hand than she remembered. Small, plastic, her photo from the hiring process, hair pulled back, neutral expression, the look of someone who didn't know yet that she would be walking toward gunfire in a Taliban stronghold. The look of someone who didn't know that her son would be born while she was on her 4th deployment. The look of someone innocent. She set it on the desk. It made a small clicking sound against the laminate. The access card followed. Rodriguez was waiting by her car. How she'd known to be there, Ashley didn't ask. Military families developed instincts about when people needed witnesses. It's administrative leave, Rodriguez said quickly. Pending investigation. They have to do it by law. It doesn't mean anything yet. It's just procedure. Ashley nodded. Unlocked the car. The interior smelled like the previous day's coffee and something that might have been hope. Do you want me to? Is there someone you want me to call? No. Ashley sat in the driver's seat. Hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, the way you learned before you learned how to hold a rifle, before you learned how to hold someone's hand while they died. It's fine. I'll wait for HR. She didn't tell Rodriguez what was actually happening. That this wasn't about scope of practice or protocol violations. This was about a woman who'd walked into a hospital 6 months ago with a cover identity and a mission. A woman who was supposed to blend in. A woman who was supposed to be invisible. And a nurse who saved a trauma patient in front of everyone had just become very, very visible. The Army intelligence operation investigating the supply theft ring at St. Michael's, the one that had been running quietly for 6 months, the one that Ashley had been feeding information to through a burner phone and encrypted channels, that operation would be shut down the moment her cover was blown. The moment hospital administration realized she was undercover federal, they'd locked down everything. Lawyers. Public relations. Damage control. The surgical equipment trafficking ring would scatter like roaches. 3 months of surveillance would evaporate. And Major Reyes, the man her son served under, the man who'd been scheduled to deploy again in 52 days, would go back into the system without oversight. Without protection. Without the person who'd promised his mother, "I'll keep an eye on him." Ashley drove to Academy Boulevard. The diner there was open 24 hours, the way certain places always are in military towns, existing for the people who need somewhere to sit at odd hours. She ordered coffee. Black. No sugar. The kind you drink because you need something warm in your hands, not because you need it to taste good. 3:13 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Colorado Springs. The rain had started somewhere between the hospital and here. Not gentle rain. The kind that hammered the pavement like judgment, like consequence, like the universe reminding you that actions have weight. She sat by the window. The diner's fluorescent lights turned the glass into a mirror, showed her a woman in blue scrubs with the hospital logo starting to fade from repeated washing, showed her her own reflection staring back like a question. The coffee got cold. She watched the rings form on the laminate tabletop where the cup Saturday. 1 ring. 2. 3. Each one marking the passage of minutes she wasn't using to do anything useful. Each one a small admission of defeat. The faded unit patch was still in her jacket, sewn into the lining 6 months ago when she'd taken this job. 5th Special Forces Group. Her unit. The unit her son belonged to. The unit Major Reyes commanded. The one thing she had that nobody at the hospital knew about, the one thing that would mean everything the moment someone put it together with the military bearing no one was supposed to notice. With the way she'd moved in that trauma bay. With the decisive certainty of someone who'd spent more time in operating theaters in Kandahar than in civilian ones. She reached into her pocket. Found it. Rough fabric, thread worn from 18 months of her thumb finding it in difficult moments. For half a second, maybe longer, maybe time worked differently at 3 a.m., she considered throwing it away. Not destroying it. Just leaving it on the table. Let someone find it. Let someone turn it into lost and found. Stop carrying proof of something that was about to destroy her. The thing was, the patch already had. Her fingers closed around it. The thread didn't break. It held. She stared at her reflection in the window. At the woman who'd spent 8 months pretending to be someone small, someone quiet, someone who'd learned to absorb insult and humiliation and doubt until they became a kind of camouflage. The woman who'd been so good at invisibility that even when she'd saved a man's life in front of a room full of people, she'd still been invisible. Except to one person. The person who'd recognized command voice and understood that no amount of nursing school teaches you how to sound like that. The person who'd understood that the procedure she'd performed wasn't learned in Colorado. It was learned in a place where medical school is a war, and the curriculum is survival. The rain hit the window in sheets. Her phone sat on the table. Blank. Silent. No incoming messages. No calls from people she'd trained with. No contact from the Army Intelligence Operation Coordinator. No word from anyone who could possibly help. There was a moment, just a moment, where she believed Pierce had won. Where she believed that competence without credentials really did mean nothing. Where she believed that quiet people were always meant to stay quiet. And then she heard it. Distant at first. Easy to mistake for wind or thunder. But it grew closer, became something solid, something real. The sound of a helicopter, a UH-60M Black Hawk, moving through the rain toward some destination that wasn't for her, was probably just someone else's emergency, someone else's crisis. She watched the coffee rings expand on the table. The helicopter sound grew louder. It was only when she saw the red navigation lights flash past the diner window that she understood. 4 days later, a trauma case arrived unconscious from a highway rollover on Interstate 25. The paramedics had radioed ahead, multi-vehicle collision, driver ejected, critical head trauma, estimated arrival 4 minutes. The trauma bay doors burst open and Ashley watched from the corner of the unit, her badge already confiscated, her access restricted to observation only. She stood in the hallway like a ghost in Scrubs, forbidden to touch, forbidden to help, watching as residents scrambled and Dr. Pierce barked orders with the confidence of a man who'd never been questioned. The patient coded twice during the initial workup. Both times, Ashley's hands moved instinctively toward the crash cart before she stopped herself. Not her patient. Not her problem. Not anymore. 18 hours later, the patient woke. His eyes opened in the ICU, scanning the room with the systematic precision of someone trained to assess threats. His gaze found the glass partition where staff moved past, and then it stopped. Locked directly on Ashley, who was standing at the nurse's station updating charts she wasn't supposed to be updating. His pupils dilated. His hand moved toward the call button. When the attending physician arrived, the patient grabbed his sleeve with a strength that shouldn't have been possible given the morphine drip. His voice came out rough, fractured, but absolutely clear. Valkyrie. The word hung in the air like a bullet that hadn't landed yet. The attending physician, Dr. Brenner, competent, observant, glanced back at Ashley, then back at the patient. What did you say? That woman. Out there. The patient's eyes never left her. That's Valkyrie. She pulled me out under fire in the Peck Valley. 2011, Operation Red Wing aftermath. She's legend. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's rhythmic hiss. Dr. Brenner walked out of the ICU with his face carefully arranged. He pulled a file from the secure terminal, Ashley's personnel record, and began scrolling. A Marine colonel visiting his own father 3 rooms down overheard the commotion and stepped into the hallway. Colonel James Mercer, 1st Marine Division, decorated career, sharp eyes that missed nothing. He asked one question. Valkyrie? Ashley didn't move. Didn't turn around. The chart in her hand suddenly weighed 300 pounds. Mercer took the tablet from Dr. Brenner's hands and began reading aloud, his voice steady and ceremonial, the way military officers read citations at award ceremonies. Captain Ashley Cooper, United States Army Special Forces, for conspicuous gallantry while serving as team medic in support of Operation Enduring Freedom, Hindu Kush region. Dr. Pierce had been walking past the ICU. He stopped dead, his face registering the words like a man watching a building collapse in slow motion. During a combat engagement in the Peck Valley, Mercer continued, Captain Cooper maintained medical support under sustained small arms and rocket-propelled grenade fire, evacuating 3 critically wounded personnel to forward operating base Shank despite active threat, personally administering emergency field medicine while under direct fire. Mercer paused, looked at Dr. Pierce, then back at the tablet. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. Combat Medical Badge. That's not. Dr. Pierce stepped forward, his voice cracking at the edges. That's not verified. That's a fabrication. I need proof of. The elevator doors opened. A 2-star general stepped out in dress uniform, and the hallway functioned like a gear catching. General Marcus Webb, Fort Carson deputy commander, moved with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. He took one look at the chaos, assessed the situation with a glance, and asked to see the file. His eye scanned Ashley's official photo, rows of ribbons arranged like medals on a general's chest. He turned to face the cluster of staff, and then he executed a formal salute, his hand coming up to his brow with the kind of precision that meant something. All the way down. All the respect. Captain Cooper, he said. Why exactly is a decorated combat officer being investigated for saving a life? Dr. Pierce's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. The needle decompression was correct procedure, Webb continued, his voice the texture of winter. The patient's tension pneumothorax would have killed him within minutes. Your complaint to the State Board has been flagged for review. That review is now being conducted at the federal level. The general's aide stepped forward with a tablet of his own. 2 FBI agents walked in behind her, and the atmosphere in the ICU corridor compressed like the air before a detonation. One agent was tall, black, with the bearing of someone who'd seen the bottom of human nature and wasn't impressed by much. The other was younger, female, with eyes that catalogued everything. Dr. Marcus Pierce, the tall agent said. Pierce's face went the color of old gauze. We have a warrant to examine your access to the hospital's personnel database from April 14th through today. We also have evidence you attempted to alter Captain Cooper's medical licensing records. That's federal document fraud. The agent stepped closer. We also have you on camera accessing the surgical equipment inventory system using credentials that don't belong to you. That connects to a pattern of black market sales we've been tracking for 8 months. I don't know what you're. You do, the female agent said. She held up her phone, showing Pierce his own image on a CCTV timestamp. April 16th, 3:22 a.m. Him, in the equipment storage room, loading titanium surgical plates into a duffel bag. The Sinaloa organization has been very chatty about their pharmaceutical and medical supply contacts once we explained their choices. You're on their preferred vendor list. $50,000 a month, paid directly to a Cayman Islands account in your wife's maiden name. Pierce's hand came up like he was going to touch the screen, then dropped. His breathing had gone shallow. Panic was starting to leak through the cracks of his composure, and unlike Ashley's controlled silence, his was the kind that broadcast weakness like a siren. You're under arrest for federal document fraud, conspiracy to distribute medical supplies to criminal organizations, and obstruction of justice related to an ongoing federal investigation. The agent produced handcuffs that made a metallic whisper as she unfolded them. You have the right to remain silent. Ashley watched from the trauma bay window as they walked him past the residents who'd stood silent while he invented protocol violations. Past the security desk where he'd had her badge confiscated. His hands cuffed in front of him, the silver bracelets catching fluorescent light. His shoes, expensive Italian leather, clicked against the tile floor in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. He didn't look at her as he passed. Nobody looked away from him either. 18 months later, Ashley learned through a colleague who ran a volunteer CPR certification program that Dr. Pierce was teaching classes at a strip mall urgent care clinic in Tucson, Arizona. The name tag read Steve. He flinched every time someone called him doctor. His salary was minimum wage plus health insurance he could barely afford. The malpractice insurance that had protected him for 23 years had been revoked. The Arizona Medical Board had flagged him for disciplinary proceedings that would likely end in permanent revocation. He was awaiting trial on federal charges, and his legal bills had consumed most of his retirement. Ashley kept the faded 5th Special Forces Group patch sewn inside her jacket lining, where it had lived since her discharge. During night shifts, when the trauma bay was quiet and the only sound was the ventilator wheeze and the rain hammering the parking lot like applause, she would run her thumb over the threads. Olive drab canvas worn thin from 15 years of being folded, unfolded, pressed against her uniform, carried in her backpack through 3 tours of duty. The patch reminded her of something that had become clearer over the months since her identity surfaced. Some battles weren't won by hiding. Some threats weren't defeated by stepping back. Some victories only happened when you walked straight toward the thing that was meant to destroy you, carrying nothing but the absolute certainty that you'd already survived worse. The hospital had added a veterans wing to St. Michael's. The board had implemented new oversight protocols for interdepartmental investigations. Ashley had been offered the position of chief of trauma, which she declined. She preferred the night shift, preferred being at bedside, preferred the work that nobody saw happening in the dark hours when the city slept. She was back in scrubs the next week, her badge reissued, her clearance restored, her son's commanding officer recovered and returned to the 5th Special Forces Group at Fort Carson. She checked his vitals on her last shift before he was discharged. His handshake was firm, respectful, the way soldiers thanked people who'd saved their lives. He didn't call her captain. He didn't call her. He just looked at her for a moment and said, "Your son is lucky." After he left, Ashley sat in the break room with terrible coffee and a vending machine sandwich, and for the first time in 19 months, the trembling in her hands wasn't fear. It was restraint finally learning how to let go. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, if you've ever had to hide who you really are to survive, if you've ever been asked to walk toward a threat instead of away, tell us in the comments. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet warriors among us, the ones who change everything by refusing to break.